what do you get when states want clean energy, AI needs and wants power, and no one wants coal? Apparently, it's a nuclear comeback tour. Today, we're diving into America's latest love affair, small modular reactors, or SMRs. They're clean, compact, and if you ask state legislators, our ticket to the climate salvation and AI server farms that don't melt the grid. So, Stephen, today we're talking about 1950s science fantasy, a carbon crisis, and a whole bunch of legislation.
Yes, also known as the 2025 Nuclear Renaissance, complete with acronyms, tax credits, and a reactor design that could fit in your backyard. Well, if your backyard has grid access and an absolute ton of concrete. We're talking hundreds of bills across over 40 states. It's not just a policy trend, it's a full-on nuclear rebrand. Think less Chernobyl, more Silicon Valley meets Homer Simpson.
Oh, okay. Homer Simpson did not see that one coming with Silicon Valley. I wonder if they've done one of those episodes by now. With Homer Simpson being the U.S. lens here, what are the UK opinions around this? I know that there's a lot of kind of differing opinions around Europe. There's people who are closer to these nuclear facilities and get pills in case their reactor melts down or other things like that. But that's kind of, I don't know too much about anything as it relates to the UK and Europe's stance on this.
Yes. Well, it's actually quite similar to the US, I think. So certainly in Britain, back in the 50s, we loved nuclear power. It was the answer to everything, as we're going to find out. In fact, the world's first commercial nuclear reactor was in the UK at a place called Windscale. And over the next sort of decade or so, we built lots and lots of these huge nuclear reactors. They were fantastic. But then, of course, everything flipped against it, and people started to realize that actually nuclear power could be quite dangerous. Got all the nuclear waste to dispose of, and in particular, it was that perhaps the designs aren't perfect, and perhaps particularly as these nuclear power stations started to age, people started to find out about leaks. There was all these worries that the North Sea was becoming radioactive, and it got really bad. And then there was obviously this massive campaign by environmentalists, perhaps one of the most successful environmental campaigns ever launched. You could say, saving whales was one, getting nuclear power banned was the other one, really, because it's quite easy to foment sort of a lot of fear about nuclear power. And then, of course, you had Three Mile Island. And then Chernobyl, and that was really the nail in the coffin. So it was probably quite a distant thing for Americans, but it wasn't in Britain. In Scotland, in the north of Scotland, there were, for I think several years, people weren't allowed to graze their cattle in fields because of the nuclear fallout from Chernobyl landing. That was how far it spread. The plume spread. Now, it wasn't huge amounts, and that was like abundance of caution type stuff. It wasn't like people were dying or whatever. But even so, that really sort of brought it home, how perhaps these things aren't that safe. And so we stopped building them in a way to try and make them safer. The regulations, which are pretty onerous in Britain to start with, became ridiculous, and so we've been trying to build new nuclear reactors now for at least 20 or 30 years, and they just can't get the permissions to do it. And we've finally done it, actually, quite recently. Finally, actually managed to sort of get some permission to start building some of these reactors. And it'd be interesting to see whether it actually really happens, or whether people find ways to block it, because there's still a lot of people who are strongly opposed to this. I remember the other issue, of course, is that because nobody's been building nuclear reactors in the West so much, they're carrying on building them elsewhere. Certainly in the West, we haven't been building them. We just simply don't have people with the skills to do it. And so when we finally decided we were going to build one of these, the only people we could find to build it was a consortium of the Chinese and the French. And that was a number of years ago when we were still a little bit friendly with the Chinese. But obviously that completely got hit on the head as our sort of relationship with China declined. And also they wanted permission to be able to sell the electricity for decades at about 2 or 3 times market rate, just so that they could recoup their investments, because that's how much it costs to build these nuclear power stations. So it was just looking ridiculous. But the government is still determined that we are going to build new nuclear reactors because we need it as part of the green mix as we move away from fossil fuels. And so, of course, small modular reactors are the answer to everybody's prayers.
Wow. Okay, this really is the Renaissance, I guess. Okay, so I mean, let's rewind for a second. For our listeners who are not currently wearing a hazmat suit, how did we get from this kind of radioactive fear to reactors for all?
So that's a great question. So nuclear started with a bang, both literally and figuratively, of course, when the first nuclear devices were exploded during the war. And then in 1951, Idaho's EBR-1 reactor powered a light bulb. And from there, we raced into the future. So Calder Hall in England, as I say, at the place called Windscale, was the first commercial power station opened in 1956. By the 80s, we had over 300 gigawatts of global nuclear capacity.
Wow.
But then came 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. Public trust melted down faster than a poorly maintained core. And by 2003, when Calder Hall was finally shut down, the dream was dead, or at least decommissioned.
Until now, it seems. So this is all thanks to the climate commitment and AI's insatiable appetite for power. We kind of suddenly are in this area where people are recognizing that we need lots and lots and lots of energy, and it needs to be clean, stable. This is where SMRs are coming in, these small modular reactors, and they promise big power in more or less bite-sized chunks from what I've heard. So if you can give us the nerdy but accessible rundown here, what makes SMRs so hot right now?
Yes. Okay. So if you read my piece, you'll see a lot of the science there. I've got a lot of the buzzwords and a little bit of the detail around these things are. But just to simplify things a little bit, imagine a nuclear plant, but shrunk down to something that could fit on a high school football field.
Yes.
SMRs generate between 5 and 300 megawatts each. Now, if you look at a traditional nuclear power station, they generate over 1,000 megawatts each. So you can see they're much smaller than these traditional plants. In fact, NuScale's latest design, which is one of the leading sort of designs that's out there, clocks in at just 77 megawatts per module. So they can be built in factories, which is enormous, because as soon as you can build something in a factory, you start getting economies of scale. You can start sort of streamlining processes. It all suddenly becomes much cheaper. They're then shipped to site and they get stacked up like Lego blocks to sort of scale up. So you can scale up to, depending on exactly how much power you want. So you have enormous flexibility which you don't have with traditional power stations. So traditional nuclear power stations have to be built in very specific places where they have enormous sources of water and so on. Obviously, they need to be far away from people, which can be quite a difficult thing to do. And you end up, if you're not careful, putting them in areas of outstanding natural beauty and areas of biodiversity, because that's where the people aren't. And then, of course, people are going to object to that. So it's really difficult. So the flexibility of these small modular reactors is absolutely key, really. So you've got smaller size, much lower cost, at least in theory, and way faster to deploy.
And tech companies are into it. So Google signed a deal with Kairos Power last year for 500 megawatts by 2035. And that's the nuclear-powered AI future that we're looking at here, folks. So we'll see.
Yes, sure. So that Google deal, though, is really interesting, isn't it? Because what you're looking at is the possibility of big corporations having their own nuclear power stations. You always think of nuclear power. It's weird, isn't it? So,
and is that going to be the competitive differentiator when power is hard to get access to?
Yes, what happens. So it raises all sorts of sort of science fiction possibilities there, but also just makes them more independent. But in areas where you've got lots and lots of these data centers, there are a lot of problems with maintaining supply to them. And the people who live around there complaining that the data centers are stealing all the power. So if you can actually get these small nuclear reactors producing just enough power that's needed for these data centers, then that's obviously a good thing. But there are many ramifications from that.
We're well on our way to that AI utopia. And of course, there's kind of always a catch here. Let's talk about what's not working.
First one is the price tag. So NuScale's carbon-free power project, as I would say, one of the most innovative and most advanced projects in the US, was supposed to be the flagship for all of this. But in 2023, it was cancelled after costs ballooned from $5 billion to $9.3 billion. Electricity prices generated by this jumped from $55 to $89 per megawatt hour. So it basically priced itself out of the clean energy market at a time when electricity prices, particularly from renewable sources, are actually falling.
Okay, so it's small, but not cheap.
Exactly. And then there's the fuel. So most advanced designs need HALEU, which is high assay, low enriched uranium. And only Russia currently produces this at commercial scale. So that's
Oh,
not exactly
no.
ideal, geopolitically speaking. Now, there are US companies that are scrambling to catch up and actually start producing their own low enriched uranium, but it's going to take a while. And while NuScale got its design certified by the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in January 2025, the licensing process for actual projects remains painfully slow, expensive, and really full of "we'll get back to you" vibes.
Ah, okay, okay. So let's get into the legislation here. Despite the issues, there's a real buzz around SMRs at both the state and federal level. So who's leading the charge here in the state houses?
Oh, well, it's a feeding frenzy. There are 114 bills that are
Wow.
identified across 48 states in 2025. So it's pretty much every state is looking at this in one way or another.
Yeah.
And they generally fall into four main buckets. So you've got financial incentives, regulatory reform, planning studies, and cost recovery.
All right. Hit us with the highlights.
Sure. So Indiana's going full tilt. You've got HB 1007 creating a 20% tax credit for SMR manufacturers, which could create up to $280 million, and authorizing public-private partnerships. Then you've
Okay.
got SB 423 and SB 424, which let utilities recover costs from ratepayers even before approval. It's pretty wild, really. It's like pre-ordering a PlayStation, but
Yeah.
instead of gaming, you're funding uranium. Um, this, as you might imagine, is quite controversial
Yeah.
in Indiana, and there is pushback to the idea of taxpayers footing the bill for all of this development
Mm-hmm.
when it'll be big corporations that will reap the financial rewards when all these plants are finally up and running and all
Right.
their shareholders starting to get their dividends. So, on the other hand, though, we'll all benefit from cheaper, better nuclear power, and this stuff isn't going to happen unless the government steps up and puts taxpayer money in to get it all started. So, it's a classic public investment versus private investment argument.
Mm-hmm.
And Texas passed HB 14, which creates the Texas Advanced Nuclear Energy Office and drops $350 million into nuclear development. That's the biggest state investment nationwide.
Yeah.
And even in Colorado, Colorado has finally reclassified nuclear energy as clean energy, and that's a key first step here. If you
Okay.
accept that nuclear is clean, it opens lots and lots of doors, really. And that's through Bill HB 1040. And this does open the door to funding it alongside wind and solar. It's not bad for a state that hasn't had a nuclear plant in over 35 years.
Don't have a nuclear plant, but we do have NORAD.
You do, you do. And
Okay.
lots of bombs, I'm sure.
Yes, yes. I mean, gotta hide from the nuclear fallout, you know. All right. What about states streamlining the bureaucracy of it all?
Yes, so bureaucracy, as we said, is the key bugbear for getting nuclear power off the ground because of its potential dangers, and everyone's very nervous about it. You tend to add lots of bureaucracy and lots of red tape. Louisiana's SB 127 speeds up environmental permitting through the DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, and Wisconsin passed SB 125, which sets a 150-day deadline for SMR approvals and allocates $2 million for site studies. Then you've got Illinois, which is working to repeal its 300 megawatt cap on nuclear projects with three bills: HB 3604, HB 4055, and SB 1527. They already get over half their electricity from nuclear, so expansion
Oh,
does make sense in a state like that. And this kind of move is absolutely crucial. One of the key factors why nuclear is problematic is the insane amount of time it takes to get them off the ground. So
yeah.
streamlining these approvals is crucial.
All right. And I know some states are kind of just beginning to dip their toes in.
Yes, that's right. So South Carolina's Energy Security Act, H3309, expands its Nuclear Advisory Council and creates a full SMR planning framework. Then you've got study commissions in Arkansas, Delaware, North Dakota, and Oklahoma, task forces which are evaluating feasibility, siting, and readiness. In Maryland, you've got HB 1035 stroke SB 937, which push for multi state cooperation and cost sharing because nuclear gets a lot more doable when you split the bill.
Ah, of course, of course. Okay, so let's zoom out. What's happening on the federal level around this?
Well, the Trump administration has gone all in on this.
Hmm.
On day one, Trump declared a national energy emergency.
Yeah.
A bit hyperbolic, but there you go. Then on May the 23rd, he signed 4 executive orders to ramp up nuclear, quadrupling nuclear capacity from 100 gigawatts to 400 gigawatts by 2050, and building 10 new large reactors by 2030. Licensing timelines for these are to be capped at 18 months to sort of force things to move quickly. The NRC has to restructure its staff to focus on reactor approvals, and the Department of Energy is still funding $900 million in SMR development. They even released 20 metric tons of HALEU, this sort of low enriched uranium, from reserves to jumpstart the fuel supply chain.
Wow, that is aggressive, but I guess so are the global stakes.
Yes, exactly. So this is also about competing with China and Russia, who dominate 87% of international nuclear construction right now. So it's always great to accelerate these kinds of projects if you've got this international sort of competition, and you can say, oh no, China's dominating, what are we going to do? So the US now is pushing exports and trying to lead again in this nuclear tech.
All right, so what is the TLDR on all of this?
Well, SMRs are the comeback kid of nuclear energy. They offer cleaner power, smaller footprints, and promise faster deployment. But the costs are still high, the fuel is complicated, and the red tape hasn't vanished yet. States are driving the innovation with big incentives and planning, but it's still a gamble, one that depends on public trust, private capital, and whether regulators can keep up with the reactors.
All right. Well, the next 5 years are going to tell us if this nuclear renaissance is actually going to power up or fizzle out like many of the ambitious energy dreams before it. So until then, we'll be here splitting atoms and decoding acronyms one bill at a time.
This has been Beyond the Bill Number. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell your AI assistant to go nuclear in a responsible, fully permitted, heavily guardrailed way, of course.
Catch you next time.